because they'll tell you the things that are most noted with the copies that would be suspicious or would be close enough to the original to fool somebody. And that's not necessarily done for duplistic purposes. It might be just something that was printed in a bookcase. It might be
an accident, just a misprint. Or
well, that can happen, but it also might be a situation where somebody had made a genuine copy of something, and somewhere in that book it's mentioned that it's a copy, but to someone who hadn't looked at it before, they'd think they had the real Gutenberg Bible.
I see, interesting. I've seen that.
That would be very interesting.
Right, yeah, right. What about modern art? Like a Rothko or something like that?
That is definitely something that, if it's privately owned, is most often sold at an international auction.
Right.
And that is a typical example of a field where things are so volatile. And for a long time, any time a good work was offered, it was just the only thing you knew was it would bring more than a similar work had brought at the previous auction. It's not necessarily so true at the moment because things have changed a lot in the last year.
What are some of the most amazing things you've found that people didn't know they had when you went into a home to do an estate sale? We were talking about some of the experiences you had earlier. What are some of those experiences?
Well, one of the areas where you often find things that people are unaware of is in the art pottery area. And very often in a big house, you will find those items under a kitchen cabinet or under the kitchen sink. Or you'll find them, if there's a flower arranging room, you'll find wonderful vases and things. And sometimes they're mutilated from being, people bought them to use and they got used. And one of the things that's hardest on pottery and glass is that when they're washing them, they forget to turn the tap back on the faucet. So they're busy rinsing it and they pull it up and they hit the metal of the tap and it causes a crack or a big chip or a piece out of it. But that's one of the areas where people can have something that's quite valuable and not realize it. It doesn't often happen, but when it happens, it can be something that's really quite extraordinary. And it can be something that to the ordinary eye is rather ugly, because it can be quite contrived or quite different in its demeanor from any other things that you would see around. And that's something else that makes my antennae wiggle when they say, oh, the only thing we threw out was this big old pot that had all these ugly gargoyles all over it. You think, oh my God. And I try not to say to the people, oh my God, it's something that I'm saying inside, because I see no point to making them. Well, I see no, there isn't, Shannon. If it's all that, but the fact of the matter is, if they threw it out, they can't.
Some of the most valuable things can be materials that to the person, the average person, seem like trash.
Absolutely. And they can also be things that to the average person can seem quite ugly. And sometimes they are ugly. And the reason they're so rare was they were wonderfully made, wonderfully designed, but there was no market for them because they were so ugly. And now that historians understand the designs in that, there's very little around, and its rarity, along with its exceptional quality. Quality can exist where you feel something is ugly, but it still can be decidedly high-quality ugliness, yes.
Well, that's always it on the road show, too, where they say, everybody in my family thinks this is the ugliest thing they've ever seen, but I love it, and my mom gave it to me, and the next thing they're vindicated because it's
the thing that I find hardest is where somebody has seen a picture in a magazine, or they've read an article in a newspaper, or they've seen something on the road show, and they are sure that they have a similar object in their house. And so they just content themselves, and 10 years later they call me in to look at the object, and their Philadelphia highboy is certainly a Philadelphia style highboy, but it was made probably in the 1930s or the 1940s. And it's a terrible, terrible situation to be in, because you look around and you realize that this poor person was planning to retire and they were going to use this money to retire. And I'm the one who has to break the news to them. And I hate that situation. I don't run into it all that often, but that's the most tragic thing, because it's not something that we want to. We'd far rather tell you that something is worth a great deal of money, even though you think it's a piece of junk.
I doubt it. I bet you won't make off with the things that are worth.
Well, what do you think? But don't forget, I gave some of that loot to you after the sale.
I never saw a penny. It wasn't my money. I never saw a penny. But
Incidentally,
I saw bags of money leaving with the rest of you.
Incidentally, this was Shannon's wife's family, obviously, when he says his in-laws. And he's got an absolutely wonderful, wonderful wife and a very, very interesting family. Her brothers are extremely interested and extremely talented.
Very
so that added,
people.
They're
the ones who got you, the business people.
They knew.
We were talking about that earlier.
Yes,
pianos and
but they added a great deal of enjoyment to helping them.
Right.
What about a little rocking horse? We had a little rocking horse that dates back to the 60s. Isn't that worth something? A little toy
Shannon,
rock?
if you will recall, the morning that I woke you up to get you out of bed before people descended on your bedroom, you tripped over it and you crashed on it, and that was the end of it.
Well, wouldn't that be something?
What about
It could possibly be if it were something very unusual, but 60s is a little new for a rocking horse.
Could you just
talk about provenance?
What does that mean?
What does that mean?
The history of an item, the former ownership of the item, how it was made, where it was made, why it was made, who owned it. And that's very, very important. If you can trace it back to its origin, it gives added authentication. And the provenance of ownership, even though you may not be able to trace an object all the way back to its original manufacturer or its original design, but if you are able to trace it back to a point where it belonged to somebody who was quite famous, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Napoleon.
Right. So a mustache cup that was owned by George Washington all of a sudden becomes more than just a mustache cup.
It would be worth a great deal more than an ordinary, provided you could document it.
And how would someone document something like that? Would it be like a photograph of the person wearing that piece of jewelry, or?
Well, in the case of something very old, it would be more likely to be a painting or a drawing of the person, or some reference in an antique document.
That's amazing, to hold something in your hand and to look up at a 17th century painting and say, there it is.
Yes.
Have you ever done that? Is that
yes.
What's that like, that feeling?
It wasn't the 17th century. It's just fantastic. I'll tell you, in the area that I've had it happen quite a lot was back when Oriental rugs were a particularly hot item. The market is sort of soft at the moment. But I have had situations where I've been taking courses on rugs, and I have walked into a home and there has been a rug every bit as good as a rug that I had just seen up on the wall. But one of my favorite stories about objects showing up in a strange fashion, there is, up in Statsburg, New York, there is a house that's known as Statsburg House, and it's the Mills Mansion, Ogden Mills. And they were given that mansion by the family, and that family is interconnected with the Phipps on Long Island. Some of the Mills married into the Phipps family and so on. And it began to develop after decades and decades and decades of ownership, and not by the, I think it belongs to the State Park Commission. And it's open to the public, and it's a wonderful house. There was a leak, and it was a very severe leak in a terrace on the Hudson side of the house. And they had to close up the house for a while to fix this leak properly. And while they were doing it, they decided to do an inventory of the books in the house. They had really never inventoried the books. And in a book, in the library, they found a letter that was being used for a bookmark. When they took it out, it seemed to be very old, and when they took it out of the envelope, it turned out to be a letter from Napoleon I. And the letter was to Josephine, and it was explaining why he was a little tight for money and wasn't going to be able to give her the money that he owed her right away.
Wow.
So here is a situation where there's even an anecdotal quality to it that adds value to it. I don't know whether they still own it or whether they sold it at auction to pay for some of the repairs or that, but I mean, there's a fascinating story of how you can have just something very unusual turn up.